Cairn slaps flight attendant mid-flight. Pilot makes emergency landing just for her. The cabin buzzed with the low murmur of passengers settling into their seats, the overhead bins creaking shut as flight attendants moved up and down the narrow aisle with practiced efficiency. This was a routine domestic flight, nothing glamorous, just a 3-hour hop across the country. But there was always something a little magical about flying. At least, for those who weren't already fuming before their seatbelts clicked into place. Among the sea of passengers was a woman in her late 40s, blonde hair perfectly curled, designer sunglasses still perched atop her head despite the dim cabin lighting. Her bright pink neck pillow clashed aggressively with her leopard print travel outfit, and she stood in the aisle with the irritated posture of someone who believed the world owed her an apology. She hadn't even sat down yet. The woman, Cairn, as the name tag on her monogrammed luggage announced, scanned the rows with a growing scowl. "This must be a mistake," she said to no one in particular, but loud enough for 3 nearby passengers to glance up warily. "I paid for Comfort Plus. This isn't Comfort Plus." She waved her boarding pass like it was a golden ticket that had somehow betrayed her. A nearby flight attendant, Melissa, approached with a calm smile, her dark blue uniform crisp, her braided hair tucked neatly under her hat. "Ma'am," she said gently, "I can help you find your seat. May I see your boarding pass?" Cairn handed it over with exaggerated reluctance, still muttering under her breath. Melissa studied it and nodded politely. "Yes, you're in seat 18C right here. Comfort Plus is actually from row 15 to 20 on this aircraft, so you are in the correct section." She handed the pass back, her voice sweet but firm. Cairn, unmoved by the explanation, crossed her arms. "No, this is not what I paid for. I paid for extra legroom. This is no better than regular coach. I want to be upgraded to first class." Melissa's smile didn't waver, but there was a flicker of fatigue behind her eyes, the kind that comes from dealing with one too many unreasonable demands before takeoff. "I understand your concern, ma'am," she said, maintaining her composure. "But first class is currently full, and I can assure you this is the correct seat based on what was purchased." That was not the answer Cairn wanted. She narrowed her eyes and raised her voice just enough to draw the attention of more passengers. "I don't think you do understand. I'm a frequent flyer. I have status. I shouldn't be treated like this." Melissa glanced briefly down the aisle. There were still passengers trying to get past, some bumping into each other with carry-ons while others exchanged glances, eyebrows raised. The atmosphere had shifted slightly, just enough tension to make people quiet down and listen. "I do apologize," Melissa said patiently. "If you'd like, once we're in the air, I can bring you a complimentary drink and snack, and I'll make sure you're comfortable. But I need you to take your seat now so we can depart on time." Cairn didn't budge. She turned toward the row behind her, addressing a man in his 50s with a weary look on his face. "Did you hear that? She's trying to bribe me with pretzels and soda instead of giving me the seat I deserve. Can you believe this?" The man gave her a tight-lipped smile and looked out the window, clearly unwilling to get involved. Still, Cairn was undeterred. "This is unacceptable," she said louder, now addressing the general population of row 17 through 19. "I'm being treated like garbage. Just because I'm not some celebrity doesn't mean I don't matter." A few people rolled their eyes and someone toward the front audibly whispered, "Oh God, here we go." One of the other flight attendants, a taller man named Jordan, stepped in beside Melissa. "Ma'am," he said more firmly than his colleague, "you need to be seated so we can complete our final safety checks. You're delaying takeoff for everyone." Cairn finally huffed and shoved her oversized tote bag into the overhead compartment, not bothering to close it. She dropped into her seat with dramatic flair, the neck pillow still around her collar like a royalty sash. For a few brief moments there was peace. The final passengers boarded and the plane doors were sealed with a mechanical thunk. Safety announcements began, accompanied by cheerful smiles and robotic gestures. Melissa moved back up the aisle to her assigned jump seat, passing Cairn's row without acknowledgement. But Cairn wasn't done. She pressed the call button twice in quick succession, the chime piercing the cabin. When Melissa returned, Cairn's sunglasses were off and her glare was sharp enough to cut glass. "Can I speak to your supervisor?" she asked, loud enough for the people 3 rows up to hear. Melissa blinked, then answered, "On board, I am the senior flight attendant. If there's an issue, I'll do my best to resolve it," Karen scoffed. No, I want the real supervisor, someone who can actually do something. I don't want to deal with someone who just memorized lines from a manual." Melissa stood silently for a beat, the smile now gone, replaced by professionalism as cold as steel. "There is no other supervisor on this flight. We're preparing for takeoff. If you continue to delay the flight, I'll have to report this to the captain." Karen waved her hand dismissively. "Fine, report it, see if I care." She crossed her arms again, muttering audibly about incompetence and how the airlines have gone downhill ever since they started letting just anyone work here. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi, a child in the next row over-whimpered at the noise. Karen shot the toddler a look of disgust, whispering under her breath, "Of course, screaming kids too. What else could go wrong?" As the plane took off, lifting smoothly into the afternoon sky, most passengers tried to settle into their routines, books, tablets, naps. But a few kept glancing toward 18C as if waiting for the storm to resume. It didn't take long. As soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, Karen stood again, walking up the aisle toward the front of the cabin. "Excuse me," she called out loudly, waving her hand in the air like a child demanding attention in class. "I'd like to speak to the pilot, please." "This isn't over." Her voice was sharper now, brimming with entitlement and simmering frustration, the kind that had probably gone unchecked far too many times in her life. Melissa met her in the aisle before she could get too close to the cockpit, blocking her path with a calm but unmovable presence. "You cannot approach the cockpit, ma'am. Please return to your seat immediately." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me?" she asked, her voice rising. "I have every right to talk to the pilot. He should hear how I'm being treated." Melissa shook her head slightly, voice steady. "You are violating FAA rules. If you don't return to your seat, I will notify the captain." The words hung in the air like an unspoken dare. Karen stared at her for a long moment, her hands clenched, lips pressed into a tight line. For a second, it looked like she might back down. But that wouldn't be in character, not for Karen. The moment Karen turned around and marched back to her seat, the entire cabin exhaled in unison, a collective sigh of relief from the passengers who had hoped that perhaps, just maybe, that would be the end of the spectacle. But anyone paying attention could tell from the tightness in her jaw and the purposeful stomp in her step that this was merely a pause, not a surrender. Karen was the kind of woman who believed that pushing harder always yielded results, and to her, the perceived indignity of being placed among the regular passengers had escalated far beyond a simple seating issue. In her mind, it had transformed into a full-blown civil rights violation, one that required protest and punishment, and she would not be satisfied until someone, anyone, was made to pay. Once back in her seat, Karen immediately pulled out her phone and began recording. She angled the camera toward herself, her face twisted into a pout of righteous fury. "This is your warning," she said, her voice deliberately loud enough for others to hear. "I'm documenting this treatment. I was denied my paid upgrade, humiliated in front of the entire cabin, and now I'm being told I can't speak to the pilot. What are they hiding? What are they afraid of?" She paused, as if waiting for applause or sympathy from her unwilling audience. But most passengers had learned long ago how to pretend they weren't listening. A few glanced up, some smirked, but most just shifted in their seats, silently willing the plane to keep moving forward and hoping the drama would die a natural death. But Karen wasn't interested in being ignored. She turned the camera toward Melissa, who was now walking calmly back down the aisle, performing post-takeoff checks. "This is the woman," Karen said into her phone, voice dripping with scorn. "This is the one who thinks she can treat paying customers like garbage. Look at her. Look at how smug she is. Probably thinks she's some kind of hero. Well, you'll be famous, sweetheart. Hope you enjoy your 15 minutes. Melissa didn't flinch. She had seen this type before, entitled, confrontational, and emboldened by the false power of social media. Without breaking stride, she simply glanced at Karen and said in a calm voice, "Please stop recording me without my consent. If you continue to disrupt the flight, we'll be forced to take further action." Karen scoffed, jerking her phone back toward her face. "Oh, so now you're threatening me? Classic, typical of people like you." Her emphasis on the last word was pointed, and the tension in the row immediately spiked. The man sitting in the window seat beside her shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his headphones and turning away, but even with the volume up, there was no tuning out the chaos. Karen suddenly stood up again, slamming her tray table down as she rose. "I want to speak to corporate," she announced, as if she were in a shopping mall and not 30,000 feet in the air. "Someone needs to take accountability for this. I have rights." Her raised voice was starting to carry, bouncing off the closed-in walls of the narrow cabin, and now even the passengers who had been politely ignoring her began paying full attention. Melissa approached once more, her smile now gone, replaced by a steely professionalism that barely concealed her exhaustion. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to please sit down. This is a safety concern. You're disturbing other passengers and interfering with crew operations. We can't allow that." Karen stared at her, and for a moment there was nothing but silence between them, an invisible current of tension that prickled the skin of everyone nearby. Then, in a flash of motion that seemed to shock even Karen herself, her hand flew upward and slapped Melissa hard across the face. Gasps filled the cabin. It was the kind of sound that ripples outward like a stone dropped into a still pond, sharp, instant, collective. A woman 3 rows back audibly said, "Oh my God," while someone else scrambled to pull out their phone. Melissa staggered back a step, her cheek blooming red where Karen's hand had landed, but she didn't cry out or retaliate. Instead, she took a deep breath, blinked slowly, and calmly pulled out her radio. "Captain," she said clearly, "we have a passenger assault on board. Please advise." Karen's bravado faltered for the first time. Her hand hovered in the air like she wasn't sure what to do with it now, and the sudden realization of what she had just done seemed to set in. "I didn't mean, she provoked me," she stammered, eyes darting around, hopping to find a sympathetic face, someone who might step in and say Melissa had it coming. But there were none. Even the man beside her had turned fully away, clutching his armrest like it might teleport him elsewhere. Another flight attendant, Jordan, moved in quickly, positioning himself protectively between Melissa and Karen. "We've informed the captain," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "You need to sit down immediately and refrain from further action. You are now considered a threat to the safety of this flight." Karen's mouth opened in disbelief. "I'm the threat, me?" She was the one who, her voice cracked as the weight of the situation finally began to register. She sat down hard, fumbling with her seatbelt as if putting it on might prove her innocence. The camera phones were still rolling. People were whispering now, murmuring about lawsuits, arrests, and bans. One passenger, a woman in her 20s wearing a college hoodie, leaned over and whispered to the man beside her, "I think she just ruined her life." Melissa walked calmly to the front of the cabin, her hand holding a cold compress one of the other attendants had handed her. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply went about her job, quieter now, more deliberate in her movements, the sting on her face a red badge of professionalism and restraint. Back in row 18, Karen sat frozen, her confidence crumbling in slow motion as the cabin around her turned colder and less forgiving by the second. The intercom crackled, and then came the voice of the pilot, even and controlled but laced with gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to an incident involving a disruptive passenger, we will be making an unscheduled landing at the nearest available airport. Please remain seated and follow the instructions of the cabin crew." The cabin erupted in low voices and stunned expressions. Someone in the back whispered, "They're landing just for her," and someone else responded, "Damn right they are." Karen turned toward the window, her reflection staring back at her in the glass, angry, confused, and now, finally, afraid. As the announcement ended, the atmosphere inside the plane shifted entirely. What had once been the idle hum of a standard domestic flight had transformed into a suspended silence filled with disbelief, tension, and the invisible hum of anticipation. There was a strange sort of energy that moved through the cabin now, as if everyone was holding their breath at once, uncertain whether they should laugh, gasp, or simply watch in fascination as events unfolded. Some passengers, phones still discreetly recording from behind headrests or propped up on tray tables, captured the exact moment when the words "unscheduled landing" sank in. The implication was unmistakable. This wasn't a precaution. This wasn't turbulence. This was deliberate. This was for her. Karen, still in her seat, her seatbelt now pulled taut across her lap, had gone pale. Her sunglasses had disappeared at some point, revealing wide, shell-shocked eyes darting from side to side, looking for an escape that didn't exist. She gripped the armrests so tightly her knuckles went white, and yet despite the obvious panic settling into her bones, she still tried to perform some kind of damage control. Turning to the man beside her, she hissed through clenched teeth, "This is insane. Completely over the top. They can't land the plane just for me. That's not even legal, is it?" The man didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He had twisted his body away from her so completely it was as if she no longer existed. The flight attendants, meanwhile, had kicked into their professional routine with remarkable calm. Melissa, though still nursing the bruise on her cheek, resumed walking the aisle, checking belts and calming passengers with soothing reassurances. Her strength in the face of what had just occurred gave the passengers a quiet kind of confidence. She didn't scream or demand sympathy. She simply did her job with a grace that, in comparison to Karen's chaos, felt nothing short of heroic. Jordan moved from row to row, explaining briefly to those who asked that the nearest airport was just under 20 minutes away and that authorities would be waiting upon landing. There was no need for alarm, he insisted. This was a controlled situation. No, they weren't in danger. Yes, this was a real emergency landing. Yes, because of what just happened. Karen slumped in her seat, muttering to herself, her voice low but audible to anyone within 2 rows. "I didn't even hit her that hard. She's just being dramatic. This is ridiculous. She's probably faking the whole thing for sympathy. These people are insane." Her words did little to help her cause. If anything, they cemented her role in this unfolding saga as the antagonist no one wanted on board. A man across the aisle leaned over slightly, shaking his head in disbelief. "Lady, just stop talking. You've done enough." That was all he said. No yelling, no insults, just a simple, firm declaration that, for the first time, seemed to actually reach her. She fell silent, her face flickering with something foreign, uncertainty. The pilot came back over the intercom. His tone remained even but firmer now, the kind of voice that left no room for argument. "To reiterate, we are diverting to Landon Regional Airport for an emergency removal of a disruptive passenger. I'm asking everyone to remain calm and seated. We'll be on the ground shortly and law enforcement will meet us at the gate. Thank you for your patience." There it was, clear as day. No vague language, no coded phrasing. The pilot had made the decision, and it was no longer up for debate. This flight would continue without one passenger. The hum of the engines softened as the plane began its descent. The fastened seatbelt sign chimed on again, and passengers shifted in their seats, eyes glued to the windows or trained discreetly on Cairn. A quiet murmur passed through the rows, whispers of shock, justice, even a few jokes whispered with nervous energy. One teenager leaned across the aisle and whispered to her friend, "This is better than any movie I've seen this year." Her friend nodded, holding up her phone. "I got the slap part. It's already on TikTok. My cousin sent it to me from Florida. How the hell did she see it before we landed?" Karen's breathing grew faster, her chest rising and falling visibly beneath her jacket. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone again, this time not to record but to try and find some external validation. She opened a messaging app and began furiously typing. No one could see what she wrote, but the frenzied tapping of her thumbs betrayed her desperation. A moment later, she let out a small gasp. No signal. No Wi-Fi. The plane was too low now, and she was cut off from the digital world where she might have begged for sympathy or attempted to reframe the narrative. She was truly alone. When the plane finally touched down, the jolt of the landing gear hitting the tarmac was a wake-up call. Passengers sat up straighter. Phones were readied. Some people craned their necks trying to spot the terminal ahead. The pilot's voice returned one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've landed safely. We ask that you remain seated until instructed otherwise. Law enforcement is currently approaching the aircraft. We'll resume our journey as soon as they've concluded their business." The emphasis on the word business was subtle, but it hit hard. Everyone knew what it meant. Outside the window, flashing lights approached the aircraft. A police vehicle pulled up alongside the boarding bridge. Uniformed officers stood ready at the entrance with calm expressions and practiced ease. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. They had done this before. Inside, the cabin was still. Not a single passenger moved, as if standing up might somehow ruin the spectacle. The door opened. The jet bridge attached with a metallic thunk. The tension snapped taut. Two officers entered, led by the flight marshal and escorted by Jordan. They walked with quiet authority, making their way directly to row 18 without a word. Karen, now visibly shaking, looked up at them with disbelief. "You're serious? You're really doing this, over this? She attacked me first. I was defending myself." The officers didn't respond. One reached down and gently took her by the elbow. "Ma'am, please come with us," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "You're being removed from the aircraft due to a physical altercation with a crew member. You can explain everything on the ground." Karen clutched the armrest. No, I'm not getting off this plane. I paid for this seat. I have rights." The officer's grip remained firm. "Ma'am, we're not going to argue with you. You need to come with us, now." For a split second, she looked like she might scream, like she might lash out again. But then she saw the row of phones pointed in her direction, the quiet judgment in the eyes of dozens of strangers, the fact that there was no path forward but down the aisle. With visible reluctance, she stood, her movements jerky and stiff, and allowed herself to be led forward. The silence broke as the passengers began clapping, a wave of soft but unmistakable applause that grew louder with each row she passed. Some people whooped. A woman near the front stood and said loudly, "About damn time." Karen kept her head down as she exited, flanked by officers, her face flushed and jaw locked. As the door closed behind her, the cabin felt lighter, as if the air itself had been unburdened. Then over the intercom came the pilot's final words on the matter, delivered with calm satisfaction. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will now continue this flight, without one passenger." As the heavy cabin door sealed behind the officers and the now infamous passenger, the entire plane seemed to breathe again, like a building whose pressure had just been released. It wasn't loud, it wasn't jubilant, but the mood was unmistakably different. There was relief. There was unity. There was even a bit of awe in the air as people looked at each other, silently confirming that, yes, they had really just witnessed what they thought they had. A woman had slapped a flight attendant, delayed a flight midair, and was now, mid-journey, being escorted off by law enforcement while an entire cabin clapped her out of the sky. The absurdity of it, the clarity of it, the sheer pettiness of the whole ordeal. It was something that would be retold in living rooms and on social media for months to come. And in that moment, the passengers weren't just travelers anymore. They were witnesses to an event, reluctant extras in a real-life drama none of them had bought tickets for, and that strange mix of frustration and satisfaction began to settle in across the rows. Melissa stood near the front, watching the now empty jet bridge with a composed expression that didn't betray even a hint of the adrenaline still coursing through her. Her cheek still ached where Karen had struck her, a throbbing reminder of how quickly civility could evaporate at 30,000 feet. But she held herself tall, back straight, shoulders squared, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. Jordan came up beside her and gave a nod, not saying anything, just acknowledging her presence and what she had endured with the quiet respect of someone who'd been in her shoes before. He didn't need to ask if she was okay. He already knew the answer. She wasn't, not entirely, but she was managing it, and that was enough for now. The passengers began to relax, their posture softening, some turning to their neighbors with tentative chuckles and stories of the last time they flew. Others resumed podcasts or reopened novels, trying to reclaim the normalcy of their disrupted journey. A few asked Melissa if she was all right, offering gentle words or supportive smiles, and she nodded at each one, thanking them sincerely, though inwardly she still felt like her nerves were crackling just beneath the surface. It had taken everything in her not to react, not to raise her voice, not to respond with anything other than professionalism, and now that it was over, the weight of that restraint was beginning to settle in her chest like an anchor. The cockpit, the captain made a final call to dispatch, confirming that the disruptive passenger had been removed without incident and requesting clearance to resume the flight. The controllers gave the go-ahead quickly, eager, no doubt, to see the unusual detour resolved. Within minutes, the engine spooled up again and the aircraft began taxiing back to the runway. Over the intercom, the captain's voice returned, as steady and reassuring as before. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your patience. We've been cleared for takeoff and will be returning to our original flight path. Our updated arrival time is approximately 1 hour behind schedule. We'll do our best to make up time in the air. Cabin crew, prepare for departure." The plane rumbled down the tarmac and lifted back into the sky, climbing smoothly above the clouds as if the earlier chaos had never occurred. But the mood remained altered, lighter, yes, but more unified too. For the first time, it felt like everyone on board shared a common story, and there was something strangely comforting about it. Even people who hadn't spoken a word to each other before were now exchanging looks and raised brows, passing whispered comments or shaking their heads in mutual disbelief. The man who had sat next to Cairn let out a long breath and finally reclined his seat, muttering, "I'm buying the flight attendants a drink when we land." It drew a small laugh from the nearby passengers, and for the first time, the cabin felt more like a community than a collection of strangers. Melissa resumed her duties, moving gracefully through the aisle, collecting trash, handing out snacks, checking on passengers and smiling when she needed to. But her smile wasn't forced. It wasn't a mask she put on to hide the pain. It was real, and it came from the smallest of victories, the simple act of surviving a situation without stooping to the level of the person who had tried to provoke her. She had maintained her professionalism, kept her dignity, and more importantly, had been supported by her crew and her captain. That meant something. That made it easier to keep going, even if her face still throbbed and her emotions were running on fumes. Toward the back of the plane, a teenage girl who had recorded much of the incident was busy editing her video, trimming clips and adding captions before uploading it to social media. She showed it to her older brother beside her. "It's already blowing up," she whispered, excitement in her voice. "People are calling her Airplane Cairn. It's trending." Her brother grinned and shook his head. "Well, she earned it," he said. "Just make sure you blur out the flight attendant's name. She doesn't deserve to get dragged into that mess online." In the crew area, Jordan quietly checked the galley supplies and shot Melissa a glance when she walked by. "You good?" he asked in a low voice, not wanting to draw attention. She paused, resting her hand on the counter for a moment before nodding. "Yeah," she said, exhaling slowly. "Just tired, but I'll be okay." Jordan gave a small smile. "You handled that better than most would. Pilot said he's putting in a commendation for you. Regional supervisor's already been notified." Melissa blinked, surprised by that. "Really?" she said. "Didn't think they'd move that fast." Jordan shrugged. "Word spreads quick when someone goes viral midair. Plus, you kept it together. That matters." The rest of the flight continued without incident. Drinks were served. Laughter returned. The clouds parted to reveal a stunning stretch of orange-pink horizon as the sun began to dip. Passengers leaned into their windows, capturing photos of the fading light, and the crew moved through the cabin with a renewed sense of calm. Even though it was still just another flight on the schedule, it no longer felt like just another flight. It was something else now, something shared. As Melissa walked the aisle one last time before final descent, a man in business attire quietly handed her a folded note on a napkin. She looked at him in surprise, but he just smiled and nodded. When she opened it later, tucked away behind the curtain in the galley, it simply read, "Thank you for showing us what grace looks like. You made us proud today." Her throat tightened, but she folded the napkin carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Outside the windows, the city lights came into view as the plane descended once more, this time toward its final destination. There were no more outbursts, no more drama, just the comforting hum of the engines and the soft thud of wheels lowering beneath the belly of the aircraft. And though the passengers were all eager to land and continue their journeys, they would leave this flight with something else, a shared memory of the moment when a single decision brought justice midair and reminded them all that respect still has a place in the skies. The plane touched down with a smooth thud, its tires kissing the runway just as the last sliver of twilight surrendered to the night. City lights twinkled in the distance like a scattered sea of stars, and inside the cabin a strange hush settled, not the tense, uncomfortable silence from earlier, but a quieter, more reflective stillness. Seatbelts remained fastened, tray tables upright, and heads tilted slightly forward as if everyone was already leaning toward the next part of their journey, physically and mentally stepping away from the bizarre storm that had passed only hours earlier. The plane rolled along the tarmac, slowing near the gate, the usual announcements beginning again as the reality of landing sunk in. But beneath the routine words and familiar procedures, the mood remained different, changed by what they had all just experienced. The passengers knew they'd be talking about this flight for a long time. There was an unspoken bond among them now, a shared story no one else would quite believe unless they had seen it themselves, the kind of absurd, outrageous ordeal that blurs the line between real life and fiction. Melissa stood near the front of the plane, her back straight, her hands clasped at her waist and her expression calm. Her cheek still bore the faint red shadow of the slap, though the swelling had gone down thanks to the ice and time. She looked out over the passengers as they began to stir, reaching for bags and stretching their legs, and for the first time in hours, she felt something close to peace. Not because everything was perfect, it wasn't, but because she had endured something deeply uncomfortable, something unfair and humiliating, and had come through it with her head held high. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't retaliated. She hadn't allowed the worst version of someone else to drag her into a place she didn't belong. She had done her job with integrity, and for that alone she could stand a little taller now, even as her body begged for rest. As the seatbelt sign chimed off and passengers began to file into the aisle, there was a noticeable difference in how they looked at her. It wasn't the usual detached gratitude people often offered airline staff, the kind that came out as a mumbled thank you on the way out the door. No, this was something else. They looked her in the eye. They smiled genuinely. Some gave small nods of respect. A woman with a baby cradled against her shoulder paused to squeeze Melissa's hand and whispered, "You're amazing." A teenage boy with shaggy hair held up his phone and said, "You're going viral, like for real. You're trending on 2 platforms, everyone's cheering for you." Melissa smiled faintly, not quite sure how to feel about that but grateful nonetheless. She hadn't asked for attention. She hadn't tried to be a hero. But the truth was, in a world where outrage too often led to silence or complicity, her quiet strength had become the thing people admired most. As the line of passengers dwindled, the cabin slowly emptied and the soft whoosh of rolling suitcases filled the background. Jordan passed by her and offered a small grin. "You good?" he asked again, this time more relaxed, less cautious. Melissa nodded. "Yeah," she replied. "I think I actually am." He tilted his head. "You'll probably get interviewed when we land again, just a heads up." She sighed with a smirk. "Great. Just what I need after a 12-hour shift and a slap to the face, national fame." He chuckled, but there was warmth in his voice. "You deserve more than that. You handled today better than most people would have handled a coffee spill." By the time the last of the passengers had exited and the cabin lights brightened for post-flight cleaning, Melissa finally allowed herself to lean against the galley wall and exhale fully. The adrenaline was gone now, replaced with the heavy weight of fatigue, and for the first time, the quiet was welcome. Outside the aircraft window, the night buzzed with the motion of luggage carts, service vehicles, and terminal activity. But inside the plane, all was still, just the hum of the air systems and the soft sound of the crew checking supplies. For a brief moment, Melissa closed her eyes and let herself be still. Then, with the last of the paperwork signed and the gate agent giving the final clearance, the crew began to disembark. Melissa was the last one to leave, and as she stepped through the door and into the brightly lit tunnel, she was met not by reporters or chaos, but by a tall woman in a sleek uniform holding a clipboard and a badge. "Melissa, I'm Diane Edwards, Regional Supervisor. Got the call from your captain earlier." She extended her hand. Melissa shook it, unsure what to say. "I just did my job," she murmured. Diane gave a tight, knowing smile. "Yes, you did. And you did it damn well. Corporate already knows. There's talk of a service commendation, possibly a promotion. We'll talk details later, but for now I want you to get some rest. You earned it." A car was waiting outside, sent by the airline to take the crew to their hotel. The pilot, a tall man with silver streaks in his hair, clapped Melissa gently on the shoulder before stepping into the vehicle. "Never seen a cabin pulled together like that," he said. "What you did today set the tone for everyone. You kept the plane in the air when things could have spiraled. That's leadership." Melissa smiled, modest but proud, and slid into the car beside Jordan. The city passed by in blurs of light and shadow as they drove through the night. Her phone buzzed once, then again, then several times in a row. She didn't look at it. Not yet. For now, she leaned her head against the window and allowed the quiet to cradle her. Back at the airport terminal, Karen sat slouched on a bench in a holding room, handcuffed and silent. Her phone had been taken for evidence, and her face was devoid of the smug self-righteousness she had worn like armor on the flight. Now she looked small. Not physically. She still wore her expensive jacket, still had her designer handbag, but the defiance was gone. The viral clips of her behavior had already begun to circle the globe. The hashtags were brutal. The comments worse. She wasn't a victim. Not this time. Not in the eyes of anyone who had watched what she'd done. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Talk shows, morning news segments, late-night jokes. "Mid-air meltdown leads to emergency landing," they said. "Flight attendant shows remarkable professionalism in face of attack," others added. But to Melissa, it was just one more day in the sky. One more reminder of how fast things can change, how quickly chaos can find you, and how important it is to hold the line when everything else is falling apart. Later, as she stood in front of a mirror in her hotel room, carefully brushing her hair back and adjusting her uniform for her next flight, she paused and looked at her own reflection. There was still a faint mark on her cheek, but it was healing. Her eyes looked tired, but there was a steadiness in them that hadn't been there before. She gave herself a small, confident nod. The skis were wide and unpredictable, and sometimes full of turbulence, but she was ready. And as long as she wore the wings pinned above her heart, she'd meet whatever came next with grace, and never, ever let someone else write her story for her.